The evolution of Rambo's hair over the course of this franchise might be more significant than his character's evolution. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be ranking the 5 Rambo films as part of my franchise Rankography series. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. So what is a rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them, rather than any specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the Rambo franchise in the comments below. I've had a bit of an odd relationship with the Rambo franchise. The first time I saw First Blood, I was pretty young and didn't really take in much of the movie. But because of how entrenched in pop culture Rambo is, I had this incorrect, perceived sense of understanding about the franchise for years. I didn't sit down to really watch First Blood until I was a teenager, just before the release of the 4th movie, and I never got around to watching 2 or 3 until my mid-20s. So my experience with the franchise has been pretty inconsistent, but I've also found that the franchise itself is very inconsistent, which makes for an interesting ranking. I've already reviewed all 5 of these movies on this channel, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put the links in the description below, and I'll also link them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this rankography started. Coming in at number 5, Rambo 3. This was the easiest placement in this rankography for me, because I think this is definitely the weakest Rambo movie. From a story standpoint, this is a surprisingly dull film. It sounds crazy calling a Rambo movie dull, but there really isn't all that much to latch onto here. The rescue mission aspect should have been compelling, especially given the character at the center of that rescue, but somehow this movie squanders that. I also think that the desert setting of Afghanistan didn't really help the movie either. A dull story and strange setting could have been forgiven had there been some sort of progression or development with the character of John Rambo, but he's surprisingly stagnant here. The action's decent at points, which saves this film from being a total disappointment, but unfortunately even that's not enough to raise this movie to mediocrity. It's really no surprise that this was the last Rambo movie for 20 years. Coming in at number 4, Rambo First Blood Part 2. This movie was the transition point of the franchise, and really set a precedent for action sequels of the 80s. It stripped away the gritty, emotional depth of the first movie, and replaced it with very bombastic, in-your-face, over-the-top action. That, combined with actually putting Rambo in Vietnam, produced nearly all of the iconic Rambo imagery that everybody always associates with the franchise. So, on one hand, this movie turned Rambo into a pop culture icon. But on the other hand, it took away a lot of what made the first movie so good and so impactful. The action's entertaining for sure, but it feels strangely inconsequential and hollow by comparison. There are definitely attempts to recapture some of the spirit of First Blood, but it all feels a little half-hearted, which ultimately makes this a pretty disappointing follow-up to First Blood. Coming in at number 3, Rambo Last Blood. The fact that this franchise is still going after 37 years is pretty impressive. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about this movie. It's a weird one that doesn't quite fit into the franchise, but also doesn't stand out so much that it's unbelievable or absurd. Rambo 3 has always been the black sheep of the franchise in terms of its story and setting, but Last Blood certainly gets that honor now. Rather than a jungle war movie, this is a pretty generic action thriller that puts Rambo in a Mexican city and on a ranch. It's weird, but that's fine. The problem comes from the fact that Rambo could have been swapped out for any number of other action movie characters, and the film would have basically been the same. The plot's a bit dull and definitely takes a long time to get going, but fortunately, the third act completely saves this movie for me. The pace picks up significantly, and it turns into a brutal, revenge-driven mashup of Rambo, Death Wish, and, honestly, Home Alone. It's violent, entertaining, and satisfying, so it's really a shame that it's such a slog to get there. This movie is a tad bit better than First Blood Part 2 for me, but I wish they had done something to more obviously bring the franchise's story full circle. Coming in at number 2, Rambo. After a 2-decade-long hiatus, you'd think a return to the Rambo franchise would be a disappointing affair, but amazingly, this is a pretty great movie. It's much, much, much better than number 3 on this list, and honestly, it was a bit of a toss-up between this film and what ended up taking the number 1 spot. Rambo is everything you want in a franchise revival, and more importantly, everything you want in a Rambo movie. The story's pretty simple, but it's extremely effective in its simplicity. Plus, it acknowledges how long it's been since Rambo 3 and does a good job of incorporating that into the plot, giving us an older Rambo who still retains the core essence of the character we've known for decades. And much to the delight of Rambo fans everywhere, this movie packs quite a bloody punch in the action department. Personally, I think it has the best action of the franchise and has some of the most visceral and violent sequences I've ever seen in an action movie. So that means my number 1 Rambo film is First Blood. This was a tough call for me, but I had to give this one a slight edge over Rambo 4 because it not only sets up the character of John Rambo, but it's also the only film in the franchise that has something meaningful to say. Given the pop culture status of Rambo and the very action-intensive sequels, First Blood can seem almost tame by comparison. Kinda crazy when you think about how bonkers this movie actually gets, but the action here doesn't have that movie action feel. It's gritty and feels like something that could be real, which sets this movie apart from most of its sequels. The other thing that sets it apart is definitely the impactful nature of the story. We think of Rambo as this bombastic, bandanaed warrior who goes charging into the jungle, machine gun blazing, but his origins are a lot more subdued. He's an extremely reluctant and lost character, severely suffering from PTSD. And so when faced with profiling and unwarranted prejudice, he does everything he can just to be left alone. He takes it to the extreme, but despite all the craziness that ensues, Rambo still has some restraint, which is something he loses over the course of this franchise. And while the action here is entertaining, I think this movie is actually most successful as a pointed character study, so that emotional heft pushes this one into the number 1 spot for me. Alright, so that's my rankography of the Rambo franchise. 5 films from one of the longest running and most consistently inconsistent series out there. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so make sure to post it in the comments below. Also, be sure to check out my reviews of all 5 Rambo films for some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button, and if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more rankographies like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.